first case comes from a guy named Anthony Choy. He's a Spanish investigator. He has a call-in show, and this was one of the calls he received. I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to talk about it.
It was Saturday, August 4th, 2018. 3 people, all 19, including Maria and her 2 male friends, Emmanuel Chumacero and Nelson Lopez Castillo, had spent the day hiking the hills in Piura, Peru. They were accompanied by Nelson's dog, Sambo, which they believed to be their good luck charm. It took them about 3 hours to reach a suitable camping area on the slopes of this enigmatic mountain. The spot was surrounded by thick woods. As the sun began to set, they quickly made a fire and set up their tents. Soon the clouds rolled in and it became very dark. They decided that it would be fun to go out and do some more exploring in the dark. They tried to summit their way to the top of the mountain, but a large boulder blocked their way, and they all felt it would be too dangerous to attempt to maneuver around it in the dark. They decided to head back to camp. At the front was the dog Sambo, followed by Nelson, then Emmanuel and Maria. At one point, Maria tripped and hurt her leg. Emmanuel immediately rushed back to assist her, losing sight of Nelson and the dog. After helping Maria to her feet, they began to slowly walk along. They expected to see Nelson and the dog waiting for them in the path. And they did. Well, they saw Nelson standing there by himself. Emmanuel and Maria assumed that Sambo was further up the trail or maybe already back at the camp. Nelson watched them and then turned and started walking as Emmanuel and Maria followed behind. They realized that Nelson wasn't leading them back to camp, but rather he seemed to be heading towards a large crevice. And this is when things got weird. Emmanuel and Maria could not believe what happened next. Both felt something was off and they stopped and watched as Nelson, or what they thought was Nelson, stepped out onto the crevice. He did not fall into the hole. He stepped out onto nothing and continued on across into the woods without stopping. Emmanuel and Maria were utterly baffled. There was no bridge there. It was just an open hole, and they would have surely fallen into it had they followed him blindly. They began to sense that something very, very strange was playing out. This figure had the same shape as Nelson, same clothes, and even the same backpack. But it wasn't Nelson. They began to yell for him and slowly made their way back to the trail leading back to camp. Before long, they came upon Nelson and Sambo, who had gone up the trail looking for them. Emmanuel and Maria opted in the moment to not tell Nelson of the strange doppelganger they had just encountered. Nelson could sense something was up, so they agreed to tell him later when they got back to camp. As they left the forested area, they began to hear loud noises of something descending from the summit. They could hear branches breaking and rocks being trampled. If it was an animal, then it was a large one. Frightened, they immediately rushed back to camp and hid inside one of the tents. Sambo the dog had other ideas and ran off barking towards the edge of the forest line, though it quickly returned. It was trembling and whimpering, and they promptly let it inside the tent where it hid behind its master. The 3 friends decided to turn off their cell phones. They wanted to save their batteries in case they needed them later. Emmanuel and Maria then told Nelson about what had taken place earlier, the strange figure that looked like him that seemed to try to lead them to the crevice. As the friends sat inside the tent chatting, a strange fog settled down in the area near the tents. They could see it easily through the tent flaps. As he watched, Emmanuel started to feel chills through his whole body. They then spotted a diffused light outside their tent, maybe about 3 meters away. They were curious about the source of the light, and they reasoned that it was most likely somebody hiking and carrying a flashlight passing by the area. They ignored it. Moments later, Emmanuel felt the chills again, and then 4 lights appeared outside the tent. They slowly began to approach the tent. As they drew closer, the friends began to make out that these weren't just balls of light, but rather humanoid in shape. They appeared to be standing around 6.5 feet tall and were luminous. They thought briefly that it might be 4 people in full bodysuits that glowed, but why? They were in the middle of nowhere in the forest in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. All three of the witnesses reacted differently to their approach. Emmanuel began shaking uncontrollably. Maria began to cry as she was suddenly overwhelmed by an incredible sense of grief. And Nelson began to hyperventilate uncontrollably. However, the dog Sambo was now sleeping soundly. As the reality of the situation hit them, that these might not be people but something else, something unknown, all three became petrified and overcome with fear. They started to pray aloud. Even stranger, Emmanuel began remembering phrases from the Bible which he had never read. The figures had drawn close to the tent before moving away back into the forest. They eventually became barely visible, diffused points of light. All three friends remained sitting inside the tent, wondering what they had just seen, still watching the now distant lights. As they watched, the four lights suddenly seemed to fuse themselves into a giant, luminous, humanoid entity. Four became one, which illuminated the area like daytime. The giant luminous entity stretched its arms out forward and disappeared. Around this time, the fog seemed to dissipate. After a while, all three friends stepped out of the tent. They thought maybe the strangeness was over. They scanned the wooded area for the luminous figures, and that's when they began to make out several large, quote, panther-like animals roaming around in the forest. This frightened them enough that they immediately crawled back into their tent. They did not leave again until 6 a.m. the next morning, whereupon they went back down the trail to their cars and returned to town. It was mid-January 2014, Michael, no last name provided, and some of his friends had elected to do some winter camping. Michael had never actually camped before, and the thought of it intrigued him. The friends all drove their vehicles up to the woods in an area outside of the town of Circleville, in Ohio. During the first night, Michael recalled that a bunch of the guys began speaking about an old, abandoned, overgrown mining town, about 3 miles away from where they were camping. Supposedly, this ghost town was also called Circleville. They discussed hiking out the next morning to go see it. They all thought it would be a fun little adventure. When the morning came, they all began planning their trip. They gathered some things and they drove their cars up to the trail entrance and began their trek to the mining town. They quickly came upon a small river, but were able to cross it thanks to a large fallen tree which connected the two sides. They carefully crossed it and began walking further into the woods, eventually arriving at some old, out-of-commission railroad tracks. The friends had heard that they had to follow these tracks 3 miles, and it should take them right into the old Circleville mining town. They started walking down the tracks. After some time, it dawned on them that they had been walking much longer than the 3 miles, and they began to wonder if they had somehow walked past the town and not realized it. They decided to turn around and go back. Despite looking, they were never able to find the town and just decided to head back to the cars and return to camp. In the distance, as they walked, they heard a train whistle, as if a train was coming down the tracks. They kept hearing it, but it never actually appeared. It always seemed to be the same distance away, never moving any closer. They agreed that it was very strange, and they wondered if it was the wind playing tricks on them. When they got back to the river, the guys were shocked to find the heavy log that they had used to cross earlier was now gone. Somebody apparently moved it, but who and why? They had no choice but to follow the river down to a narrowing, and that's when they saw something that utterly baffled them. Despite it being absolutely freezing in wintertime, there was a woman floating or swimming down the river dressed in some kind of old bathing suit. All 5 of them thought it was strange, even a little creepy, but they assumed that she knew what she was doing and they carried on. Michael noted that she appeared normal looking with a scar on her chest and a mole on her face. At no point did she indicate that she needed help. That said, they all got a weird vibe from her, like there was something off about her. Michael believed, in hindsight, that what he and his friends encountered was some type of nature entity, possibly some type of forest witch. She very much unnerved them, and they continued to talk about her long after getting back to camp. They were all admittedly very freaked out by her. As night fell, the friends all started to feel restless. Eventually, they turned in for the night. The next morning, the friends revealed to each other the very strange dream that they had had. They all remembered seeing a signpost in their dream that read, "Half mile to Circleville." Again, they all dreamt this, something they found a little odd. How is it possible that 5 friends could all have the same dream, they wondered. As the morning turned into afternoon, the strangeness kept coming, this time in the form of a giggle. The friends began to hear what sounded like a woman giggling in the forest, though they were a half a mile away from anybody. There were no campers nearby, no houses, and they had not seen any hikers. Any attempt to find the source of the giggling turned up nothing. They reasoned that it could be the creepy woman that they had seen in the river, but they would surely see her walking around, but nothing. As the day went on, Michael's friends began seeing shadows moving in the corner of their eyes, and they got the feeling as though they were being watched. When they turned to look at the fleeting shadows, there was nothing there. They all agreed that it was a very eerie place. When night came, Michael recalled that he was quite cold and decided to sleep in the back seat of the car. He remembered being woken up by the feeling of the car shaking. He looked around but saw nothing. He went back to sleep and it happened again. This time when he woke up, he could see 5 figures standing around his car. He thought at first that it was his friends, but then realized that there was 5 of them. He described them as amorphous black blobs with vaguely human-like shapes. One stood hunched over the hood looking in, while the others stood around the side of the vehicle also peering inside. Before he could process what he was seeing, the door suddenly flew open and Michael was pushed out onto the ground. He was terrified. One of the entities, the one near the hood, walked over to him, and as it did, the other 4 seemed to somehow, quote, walk into it, merging into one, becoming a single, towering, 7-foot-tall entity with glowing eyes and a face. Or something like a face. There was a nose, a mouth, a brow, etc. Michael claims that he could not understand how this was possible and wondered in his mind what this thing was that could do this. It then crouched down and looked directly into his eyes. It then said to him, "You are so close." With that, it raised up and walked back, eventually fading into the darkness. It was gone, and Michael was left petrified. For reasons he did not understand, he elected not to tell his friends or leave, instead remaining awake in his car for the remainder of the night. The next morning, the friends all sat discussing the strange things that they had been seeing and experiencing, the dreams, the shadows, the sounds, etc. And they all collectively decided it was best to pack up their stuff and get out of there. While heading out, Michael claims that he observed the large entity he saw the night before standing in the tree line, watching them leave. To this day, his one friend still has nightmares about the old lady in the river, and refuses to talk about the trip. In May 2021, Michael sat down with Anthony Wallace of the Real Supernatural Encounters podcast. He discussed in detail the events of the trip. He also offered his thoughts on what he thinks might have been going on. Michael thinks that, looking back, when they began down those tracks, they might have actually walked through some sort of dimensional doorway, which then manifested all the high strangeness that followed. The witch lady in the river, the shadows, the shared dreams, the giggling, and even the entities. He thinks that when they came back to the river and found that the log was gone, it was because they were not in their version of reality anymore, but one possibly from another time, which would explain why they could hear a train from another time possibly. When asked what the creature meant by "you are so close," Michael believes that either it was telling him that him and his friends had gotten very close to Circleville, or they were close to stumbling upon something else that might have been of great importance. What it might have been, he does not know. Overall, the experience was very strange, and it's one he will not soon forget.
What I love about these stories, seeing them side by side, is that they both are very similar. In the first story, the hikers couldn't get past this boulder, so they couldn't get to where they were going. In the second story, they couldn't find where they were going. So in both instances, they just ended up giving up and turning around. And then right after, there was all this high strangeness that happened. And both stories ended with multiple beings being encountered, and they all kind of morphed into one being. In the first story, they were light beings. In the second story, they were like all black shadow beings. But in both instances, they seem to walk into each other and then become one. It's interesting that in the first story, if you count the dog, there was four of these people, and there was 4 light beings. In the second story, there was 5 friends, and there was 5 all black beings. And in both instances, they became one. It's just an interesting detail. I don't know if there's anything to it or just a coincidence, but